Have you ever realized that you didn't betray your mother? You just stopped letting guilt define your love? What if the guilt you've carried all these years was never yours to begin with? What if every time you felt selfish for wanting your own life, you were actually responding to a wound that was planted before you could even speak? Because if you don't question this guilt, you'll keep mistaking control for care and sacrifice for love. Today, we're talking about the kind of mother who calls it devotion, but deep down, it's possession. You still answer her calls, even when you see her name and your stomach drops. You still say, "I'm fine," even when you're drowning, because if you say less, she'll blame you for being distant. If you say more, she'll somehow twist your pain into her tragedy. There's a man, we'll call him Eli. He's 32, lives in Denver, has a stable job at a tech company, good apartment in a decent neighborhood. From the outside, his life looks perfectly normal, maybe even enviable. But every time his mother texts, "Are you still my son?" something inside him collapses. Not because the question is cruel, but because it's loaded with 32 years of emotional blackmail disguised as maternal concern. He visits her every Sunday, not because he wants to, but because the guilt is louder than his truth. He drives the familiar 40-minute route to her house, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tight, already rehearsing responses to questions he knows she'll ask. He sits at her kitchen table, the same table where he ate cereal as a boy, listening to the same stories about her health, her loneliness, her disappointment in everyone else, nodding at the same complaints, feeling his soul slowly suffocate under the weight of her unspoken expectations. And she doesn't see it. In her mind, they're close. She tells her friends about her devoted son who visits every week. She doesn't see the way his shoulders tense when she speaks, or how quickly he finds excuses to leave, or the exhaustion in his eyes. Have you ever visited someone not out of love, but to silence the war inside you? Have you ever felt more lonely in someone's presence than you do when you're actually alone? Because that's where this story begins, in the space between what we call love and what love actually is. When your first experience of love comes with conditions, strings, and emotional landmines, you don't learn what love is. You learn what performance looks like. Eli isn't fighting his mother. He's fighting the version of himself that only exists in her eyes. The obedient son who never questions her judgment. The emotional caretaker who manages her moods before his own. The protector of her feelings above his own truth. The good boy who became a good man by learning to swallow his authentic reactions. But underneath that performance, there's another version struggling to breathe. The boy who never felt safe to be angry, even when anger was the appropriate response. The man who's afraid to disappoint anyone because disappointing his mother meant emotional abandonment. The child who learned that love meant becoming who she needed, not who he was meant to be. Picture this. Eli at age 8, coming home excited about a soccer game where he scored his first goal. Instead of celebrating with him, his mother immediately launched into how tired she was, how she had to leave work early to pick him up, how other parents don't appreciate what she does. By the end of the conversation, 8-year-old Eli was apologizing for being excited about his achievement. This is how it happens. Not through dramatic abuse, but through thousands of tiny moments where your joy becomes secondary to her emotional needs, where your accomplishments are reframed as burdens, where your natural childhood excitement becomes something you learn to suppress because it might inconvenience her or steal attention from her struggles. It's like living in a house where every mirror shows her reflection, but never yours. You become so focused on reading her face, anticipating her needs, managing her emotions, that you forget what your own face looks like. You lose track of your own needs, your own emotions, your own authentic responses to life. This pattern, Jung called it the mother complex, doesn't just shape how we see our mothers. It shapes how we see ourselves, how we move through the world, how we interpret love itself. When a child grows up in the orbit of a narcissistic mother, they don't learn to be themselves. They learn to be her mirror, her emotional regulator, her source of meaning and validation. The child becomes a satellite orbiting her emotional planet, never developing their own gravitational center. They learn to feel what she feels, want what she wants them to want, choose what she would choose. Their authentic self goes underground, hidden so deep that sometimes they forget it ever existed. And the mother? She doesn't realize she's slowly erasing her own child. To her, his compliance feels like connection. His sacrifice feels like love. His constant availability feels like devotion. She interprets his emotional starvation as proof of their special bond. But compliance isn't connection. Sacrifice isn't love. And emotional starvation isn't bonding. It's trauma. What Eli experienced, what maybe you've experienced, is the slow dissolution of self in the name of keeping peace. You learn to read her micro-expressions before you learn to read your own emotions. You learn to manage her anxiety before you even know what your own anxiety feels like. You become fluent in her emotional language while remaining illiterate in your own. This isn't love. It's role-playing dressed in guilt. And the most heartbreaking part? The mother doesn't realize she's losing her son, one silence at a time, one swallowed truth at a time, one abandoned dream at a time. Jung understood that the shadow side of maternal love, as explored deeply in Carl Jung's shadow work, reveals itself in moments like these. When love becomes a cage, when care becomes control, when a very person who gave you life slowly suffocates the life within you. Not out of malice, but out of her own unhealed wounds, her own unmet needs, her own terror of being alone with herself. Take a moment here. If you're feeling something shift in your chest, that's not discomfort, that's recognition. Here's the question that changes everything. If the only way to stay connected is to abandon who you really are, is it connection or captivity? Let me tell you what Eli realized on that last Sunday visit, the one that changed the trajectory of his entire life. A narcissistic mother doesn't always scream or insult or throw dramatic tantrums. Sometimes she's subtler, more sophisticated in her manipulation. Sometimes she whispers the most devastating things. I gave you everything I had. I'm your only real family. I don't ask for much, just that you remember who was there for you. After all I've sacrificed, this is how you repay me. But those phrases? They're emotional weapons wrapped in maternal warmth. They bind the child, even the adult child, in invisible chains called loyalty, but forged in fear. Fear of being ungrateful. Fear of being selfish. Fear of being the kind of person who abandons their mother. That particular Sunday, Eli sat in his usual spot at her kitchen table, and something was different. Maybe it was therapy finally taking hold, or maybe he was just exhausted from pretending. His mother was in her element, reorganizing his life from across the table with the confidence of someone who believed she knew what was best for everyone. You should call more often. I worry. You work too much. It's not healthy. When are you going to settle down and give me grandchildren? I'm not getting any younger. That friend of yours, David, he seems like a bad influence. You've changed since you started hanging around with him. And for the first time in his 32 years, Eli heard what she was really saying underneath her words. Exist for me. Live for me. Choose for me. Let me design your life because I don't know how to live my own. As Jung said, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. And in that moment, Eli saw it clearly. He wasn't living his life. He was unconsciously fulfilling hers. Every major decision filtered through her approval. Every relationship examined through the lens of her reaction. Every career choice weighed against what would make her proud rather than what would make him fulfilled. He thought about his ex-girlfriend Sarah, who'd broken up with him after 2 years because, as she put it, I feel like I'm dating you and your mother. He'd been offended at the time, but sitting there now, he realized Sarah was right. His mother's voice was always in his head during their relationship. She's not right for you. She doesn't appreciate what a catch you are. You could do better. And somehow, Sarah's perfectly reasonable request for boundaries with his mother had felt like betrayal. What feels like love is actually unhealed need. She needs to be needed. She needs to be central. She needs to be the most important woman in her son's life. Not because she's earned that place through healthy relationship, but because without it, she'd have to face the emptiness inside herself that she's spent decades avoiding. He needs to escape, but he doesn't know how without becoming the villain in her story. Because that's how the narrative is set up. Either you're the devoted son who puts her first, or you're the ungrateful child who abandoned the woman who gave you everything. Here's the truth that cuts deepest. A narcissistic mother can love her son and still destroy him. Not through malice, but through emotional starvation disguised as devotion. She loves the version of him that serves her emotional needs. She loves the son who calls every day, who prioritizes her feelings over his own, who never grows beyond her psychological reach. But the real him? The man with his own dreams, his own boundaries, his own emotional needs? That version threatens her sense of control, so that version must be guilted into silence. Eli saw this pattern everywhere once he started looking, and how she'd always gotten sick right before his important events, graduation, job interviews, dates, ensuring he'd spend his energy taking care of her instead of celebrating himself. And how she'd cry whenever he tried to set even the smallest boundary, making him the bad guy for having needs. And how she'd tell stories about other mothers whose children abandoned them, making sure he understood the consequences of putting himself first. That Sunday, watching her rearrange his life with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no, Eli understood something that would haunt and liberate him simultaneously. His mother wasn't evil. She was terrified. Terrified of being alone, of being unimportant, of facing the vast emptiness she'd spent decades avoiding by making him responsible for her emotional stability. But her terror had become his prison. Her unhealed wounds had become his chains. Her inability to face herself had become his inability to be himself. So he sat there quietly through the rest of dinner, nodding through her stories about the neighbors, her health complaints, her theories about what was wrong with the world. And when he left that night, kissing her cheek in the doorway like he had 1,000 times before, he knew something fundamental had shifted. He didn't walk away with anger. He didn't storm out or slam doors. He walked away with the quiet resignation of a man who finally chose peace over permission, authenticity over approval, his own truth over her comfort. And she never saw it coming. To her, it was just another Sunday dinner with her devoted son. If you're feeling your throat tighten right now, if something is stirring your chest, that's not panic. That's awakening. The first step toward freedom isn't rage, it's recognition. The ability to finally say, without shame, without guilt, without apology, my mother loved me. But sometimes, her love cost me myself. You don't have to hate her to reclaim your truth. You don't have to demonize her to set boundaries. You just have to stop abandoning yourself to keep her emotionally safe. Eli started small, because that's how real change happens. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet acts of self-respect. He stopped answering every text immediately. When she sent her usual, "Are you okay? I haven't heard from you in 2 days," instead of rushing to reassure her, he waited. He responded when it was convenient for him, not when her anxiety demanded it. He stopped explaining his choices in exhaustive detail. When she asked why he couldn't visit this weekend, instead of launching into a detailed justification about work and social commitments and how tired he was, he simply said, "I have other plans." When she pushed for details, he repeated, "I have other plans." He stopped managing her emotions when she was disappointed, when she sighed heavily and said, "I guess I'll spend another weekend alone." Instead of scrambling to fix her loneliness or rearrange his schedule, he said, "That sounds hard. Maybe you could call one of your friends." And the guilt nearly killed him, because that's how deep this programming goes. When you've spent decades being someone's emotional support system, choosing yourself feels like betrayal. Every boundary feels like cruelty. Every no feels like abandonment. The guilt isn't just emotional, it's physical. It sits in your chest like a stone, makes your hands shake, keeps you awake at night, replaying conversations and wondering if you're becoming a terrible person. But here's what Eli discovered, and what Jung knew from his own journey through psychological darkness. The guilt wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of conditioning. It was proof of how thoroughly he'd been trained to prioritize her comfort over his own truth. He started writing letters he never sent, Pages and pages of things he'd never been allowed to say. I love you, but I can't carry your emptiness anymore. I was never meant to be your mirror. I have a face of my own. You gave me life, but you don't get to script how I live it. Your loneliness is not my responsibility. Your happiness is not my job. Your emotional stability is not my duty. The letters became a practice, a way of reclaiming his voice. Sometimes he wrote angry letters, full of years of suppressed resentment. Sometimes he wrote sad letters, grieving the mother he needed but never had. Sometimes he wrote compassionate letters, seeing her as the wounded child she still was inside. This process, Jung called it individuation, isn't about becoming selfish. It's about becoming whole. It's the sacred work of separating who you are from who you were conditioned to be. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away just to feel loved. And it's where Carl Jung's shadow work becomes more than theory. It becomes transformation. There's a woman named Claire who went through something similar. At 28, she was still having her mother critique her clothing choices, her career decisions, her relationships. When Claire got a promotion at work, her mother's first response was, "Well, I hope this doesn't make you think you're better than the rest of us." When Claire decided to move to Portland for a better job opportunity, her mother launched into what Claire later recognized as a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? By running away? By abandoning your family? I guess I know where I stand in your priorities now." But Claire had been doing her own inner work. She'd started recognizing the pattern. So instead of backing down, instead of canceling her plans to manage her mother's emotions, she said something that changed everything. "Mom, I love you, but I'm not responsible for your feelings about my choices." The explosion was immediate and predictable. Tears, accusations, threats to cut contact, reminders of every sacrifice ever made. But Claire held steady. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She didn't try to convince her mother that moving was the right choice. She simply repeated, "I understand you're upset, and I love you, but I'm moving to Portland." This isn't about blame or revenge or punishment. It's about boundaries. And sometimes, setting boundaries with your mother, the person who's supposed to love you unconditionally, is the most sacred act of self-respect you'll ever choose. Because here's what nobody tells you about narcissistic family systems. The person who breaks the pattern is often seen as the problem. Not because they're the problem, but because they're the first one brave enough to name the dysfunction. They're the one who stops pretending that unhealthy patterns are normal. They're the one who refuses to keep the family system functioning at the expense of their own soul. Eli learned to carry the guilt without letting it make his decisions. Claire learned to love her mother from a distance that didn't destroy her sense of self. Both of them discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's need to control you. The turning point isn't dramatic. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It's quiet, like a flower blooming, invisible until suddenly it's undeniable. It's the gradual realization that your healing doesn't require her understanding. Your freedom doesn't require her permission. Your authenticity doesn't require her approval. And maybe, just maybe, your love doesn't require your disappearance. If this story is touching something deep inside you, something you thought you'd buried or convinced yourself wasn't that serious, here's where the real healing begins. Not the kind of healing that requires you to forgive and forget, but the kind that requires you to remember and reclaim. First, recognize that guilt is not proof of misconduct. If you feel guilty for wanting your own life, for having your own opinions, for making choices that serve your well-being rather than someone else's comfort, that guilt was installed, not earned. It's programming, not truth. It's the voice of someone else's expectations, not your own moral compass. Ask yourself, when you were a child, what happened when you expressed needs that conflicted with your mother's? What happened when you were excited about something that didn't involve her? What happened when you were upset about something she didn't think was important? The patterns you established then are still running your life now. Second, write your untold truth. Not for her to read, not to send or share, but for you to finally hear your own voice without editing it for someone else's comfort. Write the letter to your mother that you'll never send. Write about the child you were before you learned to perform love. Write about the ways you abandoned yourself to avoid abandoning her. Write about the adult you're becoming as you step out of her emotional shadow. Here's a prompt that might unlock something. The part of me that died to keep you happy was. Let yourself complete that sentence as many times as you need to. Don't censor. Don't make it pretty. Just tell the truth. Third, build a life outside the role she cast you in. This is perhaps the hardest part, because you've been playing this role for so long that you might not remember who you are without it. You're not just her son or daughter. You're not just the family mediator, the emotional caretaker, the keeper of her happiness, the one who always understands, the one who never complains. You are also a person with your own dreams, your own wounds, your own magic, a soul with your own path to walk, a self that deserves to exist without permission from anyone else. Start small. Choose a restaurant she wouldn't like. Watch a movie she'd criticize. Make a friend she wouldn't approve of. Not to hurt her, but to practice being yourself. Each small act of authenticity is a step toward reclaiming the person you were before you learned to be who she needed. Jung understood something revolutionary about psychological healing. The very thing that wounds us can become the thing that heals us, if we're willing to face it consciously, without denial or premature forgiveness. Eli learned this slowly, through months of therapy and self-reflection. He discovered that the sensitivity his mother had exploited, his deep empathy, his emotional awareness, his ability to read people, those weren't weaknesses to be ashamed of. They were gifts that had been weaponized against him by someone who didn't know how to handle her own emotional chaos. When he finally created more distance in the relationship, he didn't become cold or heartless. He became discerning. He didn't lose his compassion. He learned to direct it toward people who wouldn't use it against him. He didn't stop caring. He started caring about the right things in the right proportions. The mother complex, once recognized and consciously engaged, becomes a doorway to profound understanding. It shows you exactly where your boundaries need to be rebuilt. It reveals the places where you gave your power away. It illuminates the difference between love and control, between care and possession, between healthy connection and emotional enmeshment. Claire discovered that her perfectionism, her people-pleasing, her constant anxiety about disappointing others, all of it traced back to trying to be the daughter her mother needed rather than the woman she was meant to become. Once she saw the pattern clearly, she could start making different choices. Sometimes we lose our mothers emotionally long before we ever walk away physically. And that loss, though painful, though it might feel like betrayal, can be the beginning of your rebirth. Because here's what Jung knew that most of us forget. You can honor the woman who gave you life without sacrificing the life she gave you. You can be grateful for her care without being imprisoned by her need. You can love her without losing yourself. The path back to wholeness doesn't run through her approval. It runs through your courage to face the parts of yourself you abandoned just to feel loved. It runs through your willingness to disappoint her in service of becoming who you really are. As Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The irritation you feel when she tries to control you, that's your authentic self trying to break free. The resentment you've buried because good children don't feel that way, that's your truth trying to speak. The guilt you carry for wanting your own life, that's the old programming fighting for survival. But you, the real you, the authentic you, the you that exists beyond her expectations, you are stronger than the programming. You are wiser than the conditioning. You are more powerful than the patterns that were installed before you were old enough to choose them. If love demands that you disappear, that's not love. That's a contract you never signed, written in someone else's handwriting, binding you to terms you never agreed to. The son who walks away from a narcissistic mother, physically or emotionally, doesn't walk away because he stopped loving her. He walks away because he finally learned to love himself. And maybe that's the most profound gift he can give her, even if she never understands it, even if she never stops being angry about it. Because when you stop enabling her need to control you, when you stop managing her emotions and start managing your own, when you stop sacrificing your authenticity on the altar of her comfort, you give her the chance to love you for who you actually are. Not everyone takes that chance. Many mothers choose the comfort of control over the vulnerability of real relationship. But at least you offered it. At least you gave her the opportunity to know the real you. Eli still thinks about his mother. The relationship didn't end, it transformed. It became smaller, more boundaried, less central to his sense of self. He calls her on holidays. He sends birthday cards, but he doesn't visit every Sunday anymore. He doesn't rush to fix her loneliness. He doesn't abandon his plans when she's disappointed. And slowly, something unexpected happened. Without the pressure of being her emotional caretaker, he started to see her more clearly. Not as the all-powerful figure from his childhood, but as a wounded woman who'd never learned to be alone with herself. He felt compassion for her, but it was clean compassion, not the kind that required him to sacrifice himself. Claire still loves her mother, but she loves from a place of strength now, not from a place of fear. She learned that you can be a devoted daughter without being a devoted servant. You can honor your mother without honoring every demand. You can choose connection over compliance. When Claire got married last year, her mother complained that the wedding was too far away, too expensive, too inconvenient. But Claire didn't change her plans to accommodate her mother's complaints. She planned the wedding she and her partner wanted in the place that felt right to them. And her mother came because ultimately she wanted to be part of Claire's life more than she wanted to control it. This isn't about becoming heartless or cold or cutting people off without cause. It's about becoming free. Free to love without losing yourself. Free to care without carrying everyone's emotions. Free to be the person you were meant to be before guilt told you who you should be. This is the path of Carl Jung's shadow work. Not about blaming the mother, but about untangling the emotional fusion that kept your identity hostage. It's not about pushing people out, but pulling yourself back in. Free to discover that the love you've been craving, unconditional, accepting, nurturing, might not come from the person who gave birth to you. And that's not a tragedy. It's a liberation. Because once you stop looking for water in a desert, you can find the oasis that's been waiting for you all along. You didn't betray your mother. You just stopped betraying yourself. If this touched something deep within you, don't leave in silence. Share what you needed to hear growing up in the comments below. Because your voice matters. Your story matters. And maybe, just maybe, it will help someone else find the courage to stop whispering their truth and start speaking it into the light. Remember, the shadow work Jung spoke of isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about integrating the parts of yourself you had to hide just to survive. It's about reclaiming the energy you've been using to maintain relationships that drain you and redirecting it toward connections that nourish you. You survived the training. You survived the conditioning. You survived learning to love in a way that required you to disappear. Now it's time to remember how to love in a way that allows you to exist. Subscribe if this spoke to your soul, if it gave you words for feelings you didn't know how to name. Like if it gave you permission to feel what you've been feeling without apology. And comment with the one thing you wish you could say to someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the healing begins when we finally stop protecting everyone else from our truth and start protecting our truth from everyone else. The journey home to yourself is the most important journey you'll ever take. And it starts with a single step, choosing yourself, even when it feels like betrayal. Especially when it feels like betrayal. Welcome home.